All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's discussion. My name is Renee Eisenbeis. I am the Assistant City Manager for Shoreview and the Staff Liaison for the Shoreview Human Rights Commission. Before I introduce our topic and speaker, I just want to have a few housekeeping items. Please type any questions you may have into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll get through as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. And then this is being recorded as well, and we'll share it on our website for those of you who want to watch it again, or for anybody that you know that couldn't make it. Now on to tonight's topic. Over the last 6 months, the city has partnered with Do Good Roseville and the Ramsey County Library to host our discussion series, It's Time to Talk About Race. We've had hard but important conversations on white supremacy and microaggressions, and have learned how systemic racism has affected many different areas. And tonight's topic is no different. With the tragic events over the last year, including the deaths of George Floyd and Daunte Wright, it is critical to understand the deeper structural issues that cause racism to perpetuate in policing. I am pleased to introduce tonight's presenter. Professor Duchess Harris is the 2021 recipient of the Thomas Jefferson Award, McAllister's highest honor. In 1998, Harris joined the faculty at McAllister College, and she became the first chair of the American Studies Department in 2003, and was granted tenure in 2004. In 2007, she decided that attending law school would allow her to expand the scope of her scholarship even further. So in 2008, she was the only law student in the country chosen to be an associate editor for the Litigation News, the American Bar Association section's quarterly flagship publication. She earned a Juris Doctorate in January 2011 from Mitchell-Hamlin College of Law and has expertise in civil rights law. In 2015, the Minnesota Association of Black Lawyers chose her to receive the Profiles in Courage Award. And in 2019, she received the Presidential Award from the Association of Black Women in Higher Education. She is the author of Black Feminist Politics, From Kennedy to Trump, and we will put her website in the Q&A section as well, so you all can see it and learn more about her. And without further ado, Professor Harris.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me. I'm not used to webinars like this where I can't see people. But what I'm going to do is share screen and put my presentation up. Let's see. There we go. Is that good?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, fantastic. And how long were you expecting me to speak again? I just want to make sure I have it right.
We have an hour and a half for your presentation and questions.
Okay, perfect. All right. So tonight I am going to talk to you all about the fact that I wrote a book on Black Lives Matter for 6 to 12th graders for about, it was about 5 years ago, and how that has kind of changed my life, and how that can help us have some information to think about what has been going on in Minnesota for the last year. So I'll start off with, outside of being a faculty member at McAllister, as Renee told you all, I also sit on the Board of Public Defense. And I was appointed by then Governor Mark Dayton. I'm still on the board. And the Board of Public Defenders, there's 7 of us. Our mission is to help public defenders provide excellent care for clients that are often indigent. And so I wanted to just share with you that I have that experience as well, and that it informs my comments. So I'll start off with one of my favorite quotes from James Baldwin. And if you don't know who he is, maybe you can Google him. And he was a prolific author and wrote, "History, I contend, is the present. We, with every breath we take, every move we make, are history. And what goes around comes around." And so I'll use that as my point of departure to talk about the story of my Black Lives Matter book. So if my dean were on this call, I would say the thing that's most important to me in the world is doing research and teaching. But because she is not here, I will tell you that the thing that a lot of professors enjoy the most is being on sabbatical. So in 2013, 2014, I was on sabbatical, and most faculty members have a sense of trepidation when it's time to return, that you have to get back into the job. And it usually comes about in early August. So I was already feeling some kind of like re-entry hesitation that first week of August. And then unfortunately, Michael Brown was killed August 9th. I took this pretty hard because it just felt like very sad. And I also thought about how difficult it was going to be to return to teaching 3 weeks later, mostly because I had two different courses on the docket. One was Introduction to African American Studies, and the other one was Race and the Law. And so I knew that we'd have to talk about this issue as it unfolded. And so I polled the students in each of my classes, and none of the students, and so that would be a total of 40 students, had any experience talking about contemporary race relations. And I bolded out the word contemporary because, of course, there's always a unit on slavery in high school, but that doesn't give you the tools or the skill sets to talk about what's happening in real time. So it was a challenging semester. We all got through it. We went home for winter break. And then in spring, April of 2015, I'm contacted by a publisher, which is the Abdo Company, which is located in Edina. And they asked me if I wanted to be a content consultant for a manuscript that was being done by a journalist right outside of St. Louis. And so I said, that sounds interesting. And for those of you outside of the field, a content consultant is just a fact checker who gets paid $200 to go through the manuscript. When I went through the manuscript, I realized that it was ahistoricized. And what I mean about that is that it just started with Michael Brown and really didn't give you any context with African American history. It also didn't have a legal analysis. So I asked if I completely reworked it, if I could become the co-author, and we negotiated and they said, sure. So at the time, Keith Ellison was not the Attorney General. He was in Congress. And I have a professional relationship with him. He agreed to write the introduction. And we went to print before Sandra Bland was killed. And so most of the people that we talk about in the book are men. We happen to have like a low evening for news in August 2015. And so I ended up going on TPT Almanac, and they had on at the time the St. Paul mayor was Chris Coleman, the Minneapolis mayor was Betsy Hodges. They had to discuss their budgets. There was no other news. And so that gave me about 7 or 8 minutes to discuss my book, which is a lot of airtime if you were not like famous. So I was very excited about this, which in hindsight was naive. I shouldn't have been excited because if you deal with contemporary race issues, there's always a problem. And so I'm thinking, what could possibly go wrong? Well, what went wrong was that it got picked up by Fox News, and Larry Elder says on Fox and Friends that weekend that this book is indoctrinating children to believe that Black people are victims and white people should feel guilty about it. And so there it is. New Black Lives Matter textbook is aimed at 6th grade students. So it's being indicted. Now, what is the problem with this? The problem is that no one has actually read the book. If you know anything about publishing, we had not gone to the galleys. It's only August. The book was not supposed to come out until January. But because there ended up being so much controversy out in Twitterverse, where conservatives were saying, you know, it was the worst thing to happen in American culture, and progressives were even saying it was the best book they'd ever read, which I would have liked to have taken personally, but they actually hadn't read it. And so the publisher rushes the book out, and it comes out in October. So this is the jacket cover, and this is from a protest from when Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore. And so what is the truth of the book? Since the truth of the book is that it's not intended to indoctrinate white school children. The truth of the book is that it's trying to answer this question: how do we get from Dred Scott to Michael Brown? And that's the historical piece that I bring to this text. And so if you think about how I try to frame this book, it's really around hope and despair. And the first unit would be teaching from Reconstruction to Brown versus Board of Education. Now, I want to hold your attention tonight. I'm sure you were thinking, I didn't want a history lesson. It's Thursday night. I'm tired. But it's really important to understand that what happened with George Floyd has been happening in America for hundreds of years. You know, that's the purpose of opening up with this presentation this way. So the hope part during this time period, of course, is emancipation, right? So after more than 200 years of enslavement, those of African descent end up being, released from slavery. The despair, however, is the resistance that happens during Reconstruction. And Reconstruction is one of the least taught time periods in US history. Even if you go to the Smithsonian in Washington, DC, you'll see that the exhibits, even the African American Museum, pays very little attention to Reconstruction. And so after 246 years of slavery, Reconstruction is where you have 58 years of legal segregation. And I underscore the legal because that's really important to think about how our country has been framed. If we move forward to teaching civil rights up until the Bill Clinton administration, and I have to put the Bill in there because young people, when I say Clinton, they think I'm talking about Hillary. Once again, you frame it hope and despair. And so the hope is that you have this civil rights movement that is happening both on the federal level, where you get legislation, you get civil rights acts, but also it's happening on the ground within Black communities. So you're getting resistant politics, like a Black arts movement, Black power movement. And so that's what you have at this moment. The despair, however, is that when you get this vibrancy of civil rights in the 60s and Black power in the late 60s, moving into the 70s, you get a lot of resistance from the Reagan-Bush administrations. And so this is not a partisan talk. This isn't about Republicans, because if you stick with me, I'm gonna have some things to say about Democrats as well. But this kind of shows that you have sometimes a step forward and then two steps back. And so this happens similarly when we get to the Clinton administration. And as we know, he's a Democrat. And so here we have an image of President Clinton signing the Welfare to Work Act. And this is a staged photo where he has African-American women on each side of him. This circulates throughout the Associated Press. And a part of the messaging is that his welfare bill is to cater toward Black Americans, which actually isn't true at all. If you know anything about welfare policy, it really impacts white America, particularly rural white America, more than it does, say, inner city Black people, which a lot of people felt resentment after he signed this bill. So the final unit, which, I have to say, I shouldn't play favorites with my books. It's like playing favorites with your kids, but I think is so important, is this unit on Black Lives Matter in the age of Obama. And it is in this section that I talk about how President Obama doesn't deal with domestic race issues during the entire first term of his presidency. And so academics who think they're witty say that when it comes to race, he's caught between Barack and a hard place. He avoids race issues because he doesn't want to be perceived as a Black president, but a president who happens to be Black. And so here he is at the infamous beer summit that he has after police officers arrest Henry Louis Gates, who was a faculty member at Harvard University. I don't know if you remember this, but Professor Gates was flying back from an international trip. He had a hard time finding his keys, getting into his home. Someone in the area said, there's a Black man breaking into a home. He lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, because it's near Harvard Square. By the time the police come, he's already in his home, but they arrest him anyway. And he insists that the president responds. When Obama responds, it doesn't make anyone happy. He says that the police acted foolishly. People who were in policing felt betrayed by that. When he came to the assistance of Henry Louis Gates, a lot of working class Black people felt betrayed by that because they felt like Obama's first response is one of the wealthiest Black Americans in the nation. So that didn't go so well. His follow-up in terms of responding to race is when the issue of Trayvon Martin happened. And so that's when the president returns to the Rose Garden and makes this comment, which is, if he'd had a son, his son might have looked like Trayvon. And so he's making these comments after George Zimmerman is acquitted for killing Trayvon Martin. So I want you all to pause and think about that. This is 2012. And so this right now is a 9-year history of what has been going on with the killing of unarmed Black people in America, which sometimes, people might think this has only been going on for a short minute, but it's actually been pretty consistent now for almost a decade. And so, the Trayvon Martin incident was somewhat dividing in the United States because a poll from the Washington Post tells us that about 86% of African Americans were upset that George Zimmerman was acquitted, but only 30% of white respondents were upset. If you're my age or older, you wouldn't be surprised by that because you'd realize that the nation usually responds with this kind of divide around these issues. If you think back to Rodney King or O.J. Simpson, this is just the trend, right? The people from different communities see these issues differently. So there we go. So how does Black Lives Matter come about? I think it's important for us to talk about this movement because it's connected to race and policing. It actually started as a hashtag. And the way that it started as a hashtag is that you had these 3 young women, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, get on Twitter and tweet back and forth, how upset they were, hashtag Black Lives Matter. Now, something that I have to remind people is that, Twitter has changed a lot in the last decade. So when 5 million tweets went out in 2012, there had never been 5 million tweets in one day about a particular topic. You can find that now in 2021, but this was extremely unusual. And so after you get Trayvon Martin, 2 years later, you get Eric Garner in New York, who says, "I can't breathe," years before George Floyd says this. The officer who kills him is found not guilty. And once again, there's lots of protests. The moment, though, that kind of moves Black Lives Matter from being like a cyber movement into like a movement that's actually on the street is when Michael Brown's body ends up laying on the ground for hours in Ferguson, Missouri. After that, you get protesters who drive in, fly in, going to Missouri as much as they can to try to demand justice. The following spring is followed up with the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore. And so this is when things really start percolating, when people start talking about what does policing mean in relationship to the African-American community. So originally, we can, just expect that there was lots of resistance to Black Lives Matter. In fact, 55% of Americans thought that Black Lives Matter was a distraction and not a very useful social movement at all. One thing that I like to tell people is that as much as folks were upset about Black Lives Matter, people don't realize that even more people were upset about the March on Washington and the Civil Rights Movement. The difference is that if we're not old enough to have lived through both of these events, we might not realize that. So there's an elder in town named Josie Johnson who actually went to the March on Washington and who's still alive. And she says that as much as we hold up the March on Washington as a movement to be revered, this Gallup poll showing that 60% of Americans were opposed to it, that is the feeling she had when she was there. They were actually told that they needed to leave town before the sun set. So all of, the civil rights movement was faced with tremendous resistance. And I think it's important for people to realize that, because when Black Lives Matter was happening, some people like to argue that it was so different. And it was so much more radical and so much more concerning. And the truth of the matter is, for those of us who study this for a living, it just feels like the changing same. Like it just feels like a branch, that this is like a third reconstruction, and not so different from freedom riders and people who sat at lunch counters. So once again, half of white America thought that Martin Luther King was harming America during the 1960s, which is something often that we don't study. So, Black Lives Matter is national, but it really takes on like a certain tone locally in the Twin Cities in November 2015. And that is when we have the shooting of Jamar Clark in Minneapolis. And the officers who shot him did not face disciplinary charges. At this time, there's still racial divide, and people are still very resistant to Black Lives Matter. Public opinion, however, begins to shift in the summer of 2016. And so I want to take you back 5 years ago and for you to think about this moment, that this was the moment when Philando Castile was killed. And so when Philando Castile was killed, there was more sympathy for him than there was for Jamar Clark. There was more sympathy for several reasons. As we know, he worked at a lunch counter at a Montessori school. He was killed in a different neighborhood than Jamar Clark was. It was caught on Facebook Live. And then the governor at the time, Mark Dayton, publicly said that Philando Castile wouldn't have been shot if he'd been white, which was very controversial, and started opening up a dialogue that I hadn't seen us have in the Twin Cities very much, in terms of what does it mean when the officers are not Black and the victims are Black. And so that was just a challenging week. Actually, the day before Philando Castile was killed, a man named Alton Sterling was killed in Baton Rouge. Then the day after Philando Castile was killed, a Black man ended up shooting up a bunch of police officers, saying it wasn't related to anything that we understand. And then the next day he was bombed and killed. And so, it gives us this sense of like what summer can feel like in terms of race relations, because things get heated, and it looks now that we have come into like this pattern of social unrest during the summer. And so these are just some images. This is a woman protesting in Baton Rouge. And this is also just to bring in pop culture understanding that chronologically, this is when Colin Kaepernick decides to take a knee, and he hasn't played football since. And so I'm just taking you through like the last 5 years of what we've been through. And so after these events happened, I wrote a different book, and wrote a book on race and policing, which is different than the Black Lives Matter book. And in this book, one of the things I'm arguing, and some of the questions I'm trying to ask are, what is going on with public policy issues that lead up to all of these things? What is white flight? Why do white people leave urban spaces? Why do we get urban decay? Why is there more poverty in urban spaces than there are in suburban spaces? And so I just wanted to go through those slides pretty quickly. One of the things that's important to think about when it comes to policing is that the ultimate goal for policing is to serve and protect, right? And so there's lots of debates out there about if police should be defunded, if police should be abolished. I really don't have a position on that, just because I feel like I haven't thought through it enough, and scholars have to overthink things. And so one of the things I do know, though, is that in communities, there are people that still want to be served and protected, even if they don't feel like they're being served and protected. And so what happens sometimes in certain communities is that the communities feel compelled to police the police. And so that is something that happened when George Floyd was killed. And you get 17-year-old Darnella Frazier, who's taking the videotape, and what she's doing is policing the police. Stop and frisk is something that disproportionately impacts Black and Latino men. We've gone over and over if it's constitutional or not. A New York judge ruled that it was unconstitutional, and then it went all the way to the Court of Appeals, and it was overruled. And so stop and frisk is just basically if you fit the description, then you can be stopped and you can be frisked. The question is, what does fitting the description mean? The counter argument to all of this, of course, are people who are offended by Black Lives Matter. And their response is like, wait a minute, Blue Lives Matter. And police officers risk their lives every day. And why should an entire profession be taken to task for what might be essentially considered a few bad apples? So where are we today? So, as we all know, we've been living through the saga of the killing of George Floyd for almost an entire calendar year now. It's coming up on the 1-year anniversary of this in a few weeks. Public opinion radically shifts. If we think about 2015, when 60% of America is opposed to Black Lives Matter, here you have Mitt Romney at a protest. And it's last summer. You can see everyone's wearing their mask because of COVID. And he tweets, Black Lives Matter. I am so shocked by this. I must have done, 10 searches to make sure that this was actually his Twitter account. But I think part of it is that the killing of George Floyd made a lot of people rethink a lot of things. Somehow that video changed people, and it started having people ask questions that they might not have been asking. Not only that, because we are as advanced as we are technologically, it ends up being, a global movement, because it's so easy for people in other nations to interface with the US and know what's going on. And so here is a statue in London of Winston Churchill that people are having Black Lives Matter protests in London. And this image is taken from the Washington Post. And, I'm not sure if you're familiar or not, but I have a sibling that lives in New Zealand, and there were Black Lives Matter protests there. So when we say like all over the world, it really ended up moving in that direction. So here's an image of Prosecutor Jerry Blackwell. So as you know, we get the Chauvin trial, and Blackwell's opening argument says that this is not a trial to indict the police, right? It's not a trial to indict the profession of policing, that the only person that's on trial is Derek Chauvin. And I feel like he used that strategy because he didn't want to say that, society was doing the prosecuting. Their team wanted to say that they were doing it, and they were doing it for one person. As we know, unfortunately, in the middle of the whole thing, less than 10 miles away in Brooklyn Center, Dante Wright is killed. And this, of course, ends up bringing just, explosive protests. Actually, members of the Congressional Black Caucus flew in to attend the protests. The officer who accidentally shot him had 26 years experience, but said that she confused her taser for the gun. And as we know, this just really made things even more incendiary than they had been. And so this brings us up to the fact that former Officer Chauvin is found guilty on all 3 charges. And I'm going to close things out by trying to open up for a dialogue. Where do we go from here? As we all know, as recently as 2 days ago, Mr. Chauvin has come forward with his attorney and said that they want to petition for a new trial. And so there is, an overarching encapsulating like half an hour take basically from Reconstruction to day before yesterday. And hopefully now we can have some dialogue. So I will stop sharing screen.
Thank you so much for that. I know it gave me a lot to think about, and I have some questions, but I know we had one question pop up from Catherine Wick. It says, Minnesota has some of the largest racial disparities in housing, education, and healthcare between white and Black populations in the nation. What challenges and opportunities does this broader context of disparities present for us in Minnesota as we strive to make progress on issues of racial justice and policing?
I really love this question. One of the reasons why I love this question is that I think we need to think about what common knowledge is. And so I'm really not sure if most Minnesotans understood what the disparities were until this time last year. I think if you were to just talk to most people, they wouldn't realize that home ownership, for instance, has a complete inverse percentage in the sense that 70% of white Minnesotans own their home, 30% of Black Minnesotans own their home. And the other notion is what employment is like for Blacks in Minnesota. There isn't a very large, what might be considered middle class. And what I mean by middle class is like, in different parts of the country, like say like Charlotte, North Carolina has a larger Black population. If we put it in like a heteronormative framework, I would say with like a mom and a dad, like the mom might be a 3rd grade teacher. The dad might work for Federal Express, right? Those 2 incomes together could make you, solidly middle class, right? You could afford to own a home. You could go on vacation once a year. You could, take care of a couple of kids. Black Americans in Minnesota are often here for 2 reasons. You have an upper middle class that transfers in for Fortune 500 companies. And then you have like a lower middle class that are coming from places like Gary, Indiana, Milwaukee. But this in between doesn't exist here very much. And so that does play itself out in healthcare because if you have 2 part-time jobs, then you don't have healthcare. It means that you might not possibly qualify for a loan for a house. And, it just goes on, right? And of course, education in Minnesota, we have some great public schools in certain areas. Right. So where we are, Shoreview and Roseville, wonderful public schools. Public schools in other parts of Minnesota struggle. And so it's really systematic. It touches upon all of our public policy issues. I think the first start is for people to even realize it. And then we need legislation, and then we need a greater plan to try to approach this. Part of it is that we need to want it, and that's something that we really need to ask ourselves is, do we want to be concerned about equity, or do we actually want to do something about equity?
Great. The next one comes from Curtis Johnson. He says, "Go Scots."
Go Scots. By the way,
What
go Scots too. She's a Scot.
What changes would you suggest be made, and what is taught at the high school level regarding African American history as a whole and Black Lives Matter in particular?
That is such an important question, because I'll be honest with you, it wasn't until I started writing these books 5 years ago that I understood how controversial it was to approach public schools and talk to them about their curriculum. And I think that I misunderstood it, because when you teach undergraduates, you have academic freedom. And I, had never navigated, superintendents, school boards, principals, teachers, and then that constituency, which I'm a part of, parents, right? And so, what I learned is that even if the school board is kind of on board, or the teachers are on board, the parents can be very upset because they think that these topics are too controversial. The reason why I'm resistant to that is because we can run, but we can't hide. So a perfect example is that my youngest was 13 last summer. And just as I was about to sit down with him to talk about George Floyd, he told me he'd seen the video of George Floyd being killed the day before. And I was devastated learning that. And he was pretty nonchalant about it, which I thought was disturbing. And I said to him, why are you so blasé? And he said, well, 20 million people have seen it on Instagram. Why should I be different? And so the truth of the matter is, because young people have access to this material, if we don't give them the tools to learn about it, talk about it, and process it, I think we'll actually be worse off.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. And I actually read your book, Race and Policing, last year, and I actually learned quite a bit of it that I didn't learn in high school 20 years ago. So I really appreciated it. Jean Nichols writes, "The discussion of defunding police is misunderstood. I understand it is to suggest how we imagine policing going forward. Can you comment on what defunding may mean to all of us?"
I think that the system of policing needs to be reconsidered. A perfect example of that is the former Minneapolis police chief lived in Hugo, right? And my oldest son worked in Hugo for a while. Hugo's absolutely lovely, right? It's not the area in Minneapolis that he was in charge of. And so I think that if you were going to police in certain neighborhoods, you should live in those neighborhoods so that you have a sense of buy-in, and that you recognize people who might have a mental illness. And you'll see someone walking down the street, and instead of thinking that they're aggressive, you might realize, oh, that's, what this person does with the shopping cart. And like, they're just fine. They're just mumbling to themselves. And so, sure, I think policing needs to be rethought. As I said previously, do I have an opinion about defunding? Once again, I don't feel like I have really studied the arguments enough. And I mean, it feels very complex to me. I mean, for instance, what's interesting is that Keith Ellison, who now, of course, is our Attorney General, he has questions about defunding police. But his son, who's in his late 20s, who's on city council, is in favor of it. And so, it's not even like African Americans agree on defunding police. I see a kind of generational thing happening there. And so you guys will just have to invite me back next year. I've thought about it more.
All right. Next is from Mary Dietz. How do we help the police in getting better? Roseville has been collecting policing data and publishing that. Has that helped? And what should the public be looking for?
I think that it has to do with the militarized training. And so one of the reasons why Ferguson was so disturbing to me is that I didn't realize that in that city, how they had, armored trucks. And it's like what we experienced last summer when the National Guard came in.
Mhm.
Like there was a need for like the National Guard to have all of those things. Our local police didn't have those things. Some, local police throughout the nation have that kind of equipment and training. I think that's concerning. I have a brother who's retired military. He actually went to Iraq. He went to Afghanistan. I mean, several places. He's in his 60s. I am not sure that the training that you need for Iraq should be like what we're doing in Roseville.
Mhm.
So that's what I would say about that.
Okay, thank you. Professor Harris, how about confounding factors? What steps have Black leadership initiated regarding factors of family unit solidarity, influential Black leaders' respect of education and respect for education?
Yeah, I mean, I get this question a lot, and what's interesting is that I think that people aren't possibly familiar with the Black church. And I talk about like the Black church as an institution, right? Like the similarities that you might have with Baptists and, African Methodist Episcopals, that preaching from the pulpit often sounds like the American dream, right? There's always the push for intact families and education. That's the kind of thing that the general public often doesn't have access to. Um, but the truth of the matter is, even though most people, just human beings, don't want to be harmed, there's often harm in areas of concentrated poverty. And so, unfortunately, disproportionately, Black Americans live in impoverished areas. And that's where policing happens. And in impoverished areas, you can have two-parent households, you can have kids going to school every day, and that doesn't mean you won't have policing. In Minneapolis, it's actually the Minneapolis police that are in K through 12 schools as security. And so we've just gotten to the point that that is moving out. Now, I sent two of my three kids to Oak Hill Montessori in Shoreview, right?
Mhm.
Where everything is worked out with a talking stick and a listening circle, which is very different than you walk through the doors of the school and there's an actual police officer with a gun on his holster and he stays in the school the entire day.
Mhm.
And so I don't think an intact family can make up for that.
Yeah, good point. Nina Samuel says, are you able to give us some background on the history of policing in the US? I've been told that current policing systems directly descend from the demise of Reconstruction and the introduction of prison labor as a replacement for slavery. And I'd
Yeah,
like to better understand its historical arc.
yeah, that's a great question. I mentioned that in my Race and Policing book that police officers were originally the slave patrols. And so that's what policing was. And then when Black men were allowed to become police, at first they weren't allowed to have guns. And then they were only allowed to police in Black neighborhoods. And when they were only allowed to police in Black neighborhoods, this is as recent as like the 1940s. Like this is around the time of World War II. And so policing itself has a history of segregation.
Mhm. Right. Thank you. And then I saw that we had a question from Tom Barnett in the chat. He says, great overview. Education is key, and those that support systemic racism continue to stymie revised education, as you've outlined, as well as the 1619 Project. How do we fight this in a unified effort, knowing that culture wars dominate political playbooks?
I mean, there's a move now in Minneapolis to include ethnic studies in the curriculum. And, I'm not sure where they are in the process, but part of it has to be a willingness of parents to ask themselves if they're willing to engage these tough questions. Because I say that I was ready to do it and I was still a day late. And if anyone is on this call who's a parent, I think you know that last summer, as much as you tried not to deal with it, it was everywhere.
Yeah, it was. It's very tough as a parent.
Yeah. And I mean, I can say that 10 years ago, this was a non-starter, right? Like there was absolutely positively not going to be any discussions about race and curriculum K through 12. But things have changed. And as I outlined, you know, if you go from Jamar Clark to Dante Wright, that is a 6-year straight narrative. That's just Minnesota. That's not reaching to Trayvon Martin or Eric Garner or Michael Brown. Like just Minnesota, our track record for the last 6 years has been that. And I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but I'm like, oh my gosh, it's only May 6th, right? I'm like, where are we going to be by Labor Day? And I know that sounds like a terrible thing to say, but we were having discussions at McAllister about if we should cancel classes when all the different things were going on with the verdict. And I had said this before Dante Wright was killed. I said, if we cancel class every time an unarmed Black person gets killed, we're not going to be able to finish the semester. The seniors aren't going to be able to graduate. 3 days later, Dante Wright was killed. And it's the last thing in the world you want to be right about. But if we're honest about where we are in the country right now, we should no longer be surprised. Like if people were surprised last May, my hope is that people realize now that we shouldn't be surprised.
Thank you. And Tom actually emailed me a few other questions yesterday. He was prepared and did his homework.
Oh, yay.
So he said, in lieu of not being regulated by external entity, such as the federal government, why has law enforcement been so tone deaf to acknowledge it needs to be reimagined?
I mean, I think that a lot of us are tone deaf about a lot of things. And so change is really difficult. And so I think without requirements for change in any kind of institution, change is just not going to happen.
Good point. And then his second one was, why hasn't there been more integration or sharing of best practices from other industries to improve policing processes? Example is a proactive risk management across all of policing to mitigate harm reduction in wrongful death lawsuits.
You know, I think that is partly because we are so geographically and regionally different, right? And so, I mean, I think what would be considered reasonable policing in the Bronx is going to be very different than what would be considered reasonable policing in Salt Lake City. And so this whole thing about good practices, once again, goes to neighborhoods and goes to this issue of concentrated poverty and, you know, what happens when we have concentrated poverty.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. It looks like that's all the questions from everybody. I would just like to say thank you so much on behalf of the Human Rights Commission, Duke Roseville, and the library. Again, this recording will be available on our website for those of you who came in late or know somebody who wanted to watch it. And that we might have Professor Harris back again. I know we're going to be continuing, looking to continue this discussion series in the fall. And focusing on Indigenous history as well.
Oh, excellent. You'll have to ask my colleague, Katie Phillips, to come.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much. You have a wonderful evening.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.